Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We have quite a big audience, and that's just a testament to our wonderful speaker here. And I now have the honor of introducing Professor de Souza to you. Lynn Mario T.M de Souza is a senior full professor at the Modern Languages Department, University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, supervising postgraduate research in applied linguistics, language policy, literacy studies, racism, decoloniality, and interculturality. Publications in English include co-edited Routledge volumes, Post-Colonial Perspectives on Global Citizenship in Education, 2012, and Global Languages and Critical Intercultural Awareness, The South Answers Back, 2019. The recent Deuniversalizing the Decolonial between parentheses and falling skies, and various academic interviews online and in various Brazilian journals. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor de Souza. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. You said I was going to speak a little bit. My experience, my colonial experience, having been born in a colony, tells me that when you have the space, take it. Okay, so what I'd like to begin with is to talk about my take on linguistics as a linguist and applied linguist, and why I moved away from standard linguistics, for not only because of what happens in linguistics, but also because of my personal reading of linguistics from where I'm located. So it's my colonial experience. And the things that most frustrated me in linguistics is its presuppositions. It starts from a presupposition of monolingualism to begin with, and it starts from a presupposition of decontextualization or code-focused presupposition. And from my experience, my personal biographical experience with language, from a multilingual background and from a colonial background, it's, otherness is so important. So there've been other languages, there've been other people, other cultures, and principally the otherness in the political relationship with the colonizer. So for me, it's practically impossible to accept a view of language as singularity, as code, as monolingual. And hence, for me, language is entanglement of various things. It's not even heterogeneity, because heterogeneity presupposes a homogeneity. And that's what we tend to understand. So I'd like to begin in my work. I've always presupposed heterogeneity and not homogeneity. So I start from heterogeneity. And recently, when we've seen in the last few years, this shift of towards things Southern and decolonial, we speak of decolonial linguistics, the social linguistics of the South, Southernizing theories, etc. It seems as if what we are trying to do is our focus, our recent focus on the local, is to say that, look, the global is general and the local is specific. I think it's much more than a general and specific issue. I think it's a challenge of the singularity of what pretends to be or claims to be the global. And here I'd like to begin with the work of the Indian sociolinguist Lakshman Kupchandani, who I think throws light on this. He says the sociolinguistics attempts to value language variability as part of the natural process of language behavior. But he critiques the primacy of the sociolinguistic pursuit for uniformity and homogeneity in a language or a language area as originating in a universalization of European models of language realities. So if you look at language from a different perspective, as he's suggesting, or from Africa or from Asia, you can't see that one-to-one correspondence between language and territory. So he says that when he talks about language plurilingualism or language in India, because you can't talk about language in India without also talking about plurilingualism, says we have to do away with spatial boundaries, and spatial boundaries not only geographically, but spatial boundaries transferred to language. language and space do not coincide. What we have, paralleling this, what I previously mentioned, this global local, Khubchandani suggests this very curious paradoxical relationship between what he calls a shared core universe and partial universes. They occur together. So in multilingual encounters, when we have interlocutors sharing different multilingual resources, and their resources are always multilingual. When we tend to think of repertoires, we tend to think of monolingual repertoires. Here I'm talking about multilingual repertoires, and where the repertoire includes not just linguistic elements, but also semiotic and ethical elements. So a shared core universe is always identified and established in order to facilitate that interlocution when in a plurilinguistic transaction. Together with that shared core universe, which establishes a possibility of connection, of understanding, there come multiple partial universes, which will guarantee that the understanding will not be specific or easy. So this is what a plurilinguistic transaction looks like. It's something where understanding is not guaranteed. What is guaranteed is the ongoing conversation, because understanding is not, the lack of understanding is not the end of the interlocution. It's the impulse to continue the interlocution. So this is just to begin to question this monolingual presupposition that there is a code and the code has to be shared for language, for communication to occur. And if the code is not shared, then communication comes to an end, not in plurilingual societies. So what I'm saying here is what we need is not only a change of focus from language use to language user, because when we talk about language from a monolinguistic perspective, we tend to focus on the code and not on the user. So when we're looking at language from a plurilinguistic perspective, it becomes now bottom up and not top down. We're focusing on the user. And this involves a need for a focus on space rather than time. And here Khubchandani's work has criticized the fact that European, or let's say North-centric linguistics always focused on time in terms of authenticity, in terms of where naming language in accordance with its histories, in terms of guaranteeing correction in language, etc., etc. Whereas in a multilingual context, we need space. The focus has to be dislocated from time to space, and not dislocated in the sense of abandoning time as a factor, but looking at the space-time interconnection or entanglement in plurilingual transactions. Here we're talking about situated space and the role of language users and their use of resources in this situated space. This means that the language will always be seen as incomplete and always changing. Very different to the way we see language from a monolingual code-based perspective. Even when we look at language from a discourse perspective, and we're talking about discourse in a multilingual situation, it's important when we change our focus from top down, that is, as if discourses pre-exist the speaker and he's born into these discourses. That's a top-down perspective when we're looking at multiplicity of discourses constituting a particular speaker. But when we look at it from a bottom-up perspective, these discourses no longer work as separable and items running parallel to each other. Because now, when we focus on the speaker situated in a particular location, having a particular history, and yes, being constituted by particular discourses, we see these discourses, these constitutive discourses being multiplied, and they're not being necessarily a coincidence between the discourses that constitute one speaker and the other. And because of this multiplication of discourses that constitute speakers, what happens is that where the time factor comes in here, we have to understand these discourses as constantly changing over time. And when we put the focus on the speaker, no longer the linguistic code. That speaker is a body that has a biological existence. So he's born, he lives, he dies, and so do the discourses that constitute him or her. And so discourses here have lives, right? Discourses here can be, they don't exist independent of the user. So the user, through his or her autobiography and history of transactions, multilingual transactions, this user will always make, as it were, short circuits between the discourses that constitute him or her, depending on his or her communicative and transactional necessities. So these discourses are modified and constantly modified over time and by that particular speaker. Obviously, they are modified by the speaker through other discourses. So the speaker has no way of modifying one discourse without departing from another. So what I'm talking about here is an entanglement, and not speakers are constituted by their entanglement of languages and discourses. And this entanglement is always very dynamic. And here I'd like to refer to the something that Kopchandani mentions a lot in his work, is what he calls a plurilingual ethos, which comes from which plurilingual language users develop in plurilingual and pluricultural societies. This plurilingual ethos is marked by two things. He says, one he calls synergy, where the plurilingual interlocutor will assume that he needs to connect with an interlocutor if he wants to effect a particular linguistic transaction, even though his or her linguistic repertoires may not coincide. But the synergy element, the synergy ethic will say, continue the conversation. And apart from the synergy element, there is another element which Kopchandani calls serendipity, which is the openness to not knowing what's going to happen, the openness to chance. So the indeterminacy or the lack of guarantees of success of that particular interlocution or multilingual transaction. And it is these two things, serendipity and synergy, which constitute the plurilingual ethos. And this is very different from anything monolingual, right? So here I'd like to very quickly then to make a connection between plurilingualism from this perspective and decolonial theory, or what was previously post-colonial theory with different characteristics, but similar issues. Decolonial theory will say now, in what concerns me what I'm doing here is that I'm critiquing monolingual linguistics. So decolonial theory will say in the colonial encounter, the colonized, his knowledges and languages were marginalized. And decolonial theory will now teaches us that we have to depart from the marginalized, think with the marginalized. Or as Enrique Dusso, one of the thinkers of decolonial theory, will say, think and speak with the marginalized from the margins. Now, one thing that bothers me with this this invitation of Dusso's is that when we think and speak from the margins, the results of what this kind of transaction will do depends on who we are, even when we are thinking or speaking from the margins. So if we have our origins in the margins and we think and speak with the margins, we will achieve a determined result in our in our communicative transactions. Now, if we are not, if we are members of the dominant community, or let's call it the colonial or colonizing community, and we are speaking with and from the margins, the results of our communicative transactions will be still marked through by coloniality or superiority, even though we may assume that we don't have it. It's systemic. So if we're born in that kind of set of discourses, they constitute us and they affect us anyway. So I think before, in my work, what I've tried to do is in decolonial theory of language, we need to, before we speak with the marginal and speak from the margins, we need to do something else. We need to you need to go back what Gayatri Spivak a long time ago on her very initial work on post-colonial theory talked about as abandoning one's privilege. So we have to abandon our privileges. We have to question our hegemony when we are speaking from a hegemonic location, even though we are speaking with and from the margins, or we attempt to speak with and from the margins. If we don't abandon our hegemony, and in my work I call this marking the unmarked, because our hegemonic origins will lead us to assume uncritically that our language is the language, our form of being, our epistemologies and ontologies are, by being historically unmarked, they are unquestionable. So I think in my work, when I say we have to begin by marking the unmarked, it's all those in a position of hegemony have to open themselves epistemically and ontologically to vulnerability. Because those of us who are on the margins, what characterizes us is our vulnerability. Right? So there will be no decolonial linguistics if we are, all of those of us involved in it are not always and not equally, because we have different histories, equally in the sense that it's our differences which we have in common, but we need to begin with our vulnerability. Okay, and I'll stop there for the moment. So my work, I talk about two things, marking the unmarked and bringing the body back. Or maybe I should say a little bit more about what I mean by bringing the body back. Bringing the body back, I've mentioned a little bit about this, talking about Kupchandani. It's a focus on the language user, not the language as a code, and a focus on the biography of the language user. Now, it's not just focusing on the language user in an Asian or African plurilingual or pluricultural context. It's focusing on the language user even in a North-centric colonial context, because as we've learned from decolonial theory, one of the things of colonial discourse is to hide the provenance, the situatedness of the subject behind colonial discourse. So it doesn't seem to matter when we read academic books which are produced in the North, by people who are not recognizing their privilege. So to bring the body back is for us to remember where we're speaking from, to recognize our privilege and try to undo this privilege and make ourselves vulnerable. Okay, I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. I'll hand over to Prof. Makoni, and he would begin.
Okay, thanks, Lynn Mario. This has been a very useful preamble. I want to begin a conversation with you by focusing on what is now more or less taken as a truism, that that monolingualism is the aberration and multilingualism is the norm to some extent. it's now being taken more or less for granted. My question to you, though, is this. From your vantage point, how far is sociolinguistics or linguistics succeeded in shifting from a monolingual bias to fully embracing the full panoply of multilingualism in its contradiction and complementarity? To what extent has sociolinguistics succeeded in fully embracing issues about multilingualism? Right.
Okay. From where I'm located here in São Paulo,
Yes,
Brazil,
yes, yeah.
I still can't take it for granted that that shift has occurred from a monolingual point of departure to a multilingual, not for us here. Then we have, you see, our constitution in Brazil of 1988 was the first time in 500 years of the colonial existence of Brazil, multilingualism in Brazil was recognized, but in the sense of the indigenous languages, not in the sense of the Afrocentric dialects and varieties that we also have in Brazil. So multilingualism was is partially recognized in relation to indigenous communities, not in relation to Afro-Brazilian communities. So even though that recognition, that partial recognition of indigenous languages is recognized, it is simply not instrumentalized. So it doesn't affect, our school system doesn't talk about the nation as being multilingual, not even multiracial. So we have that in the Constitution, it's there in law, right? But it doesn't filter down to practice and behavior and beliefs. So I'm not sure if it even is in our Brazilian linguistic ideology that we are multilingual. I don't think so.
And then let me push this discussion further. The question then becomes also, if you are going to talk about sociolinguistics as an academic practice, to what extent is sociolinguistics as an academic practice when people are writing papers in sociolinguistics? To what extent is the underlying ideology in the analysis of data still largely monolingual? In other words, has there been a shift from your reading of the scholarship from a monolingual oriented analysis towards a multilingual analysis? Or is it the case that people may argue that, oh yes, the world is multilingual, et cetera, but once they get into the analysis of the data, they revert back to a monolingual orientation towards the analysis? From your own experience, are the changes taking place in terms of the disciplinary practices?
That's an important question, and it goes back to what I just mentioned of the theory of our constitution and the actual practice, right? And of course there are important exceptions, but I think in general sociolinguistics will look at local problems, but I'm not convinced that the analysis of these local problems are still not using monolingual models to analyze them, right? Not just monolingual models, colonial models. And one of the people here I'd like to refer to the work of one of our, he's not indigenous, but he's one of our Black Quilombo thinkers.
Yes.
Who's Antonio Bispo. And he's when he says that what he calls colonial knowledge, here he's speaking to the Brazilian hegemony, right? He's not speaking to an international context. He says colonial knowledge is always cosmophobic and not cosmological. What does he mean by this? Cosmophobic is, he says, because these people, our white hegemony, our Eurocentric epistemologies that still dominate here in Brazil,
Mhm.
they are all cosmophobic in the sense that they can't deal with cultural linguistic knowledges which don't separate the human from other forms of nature.
Mhm.
So they can't deal with the multiplicity, not as now I have a human and a possibly other human, the
Mhm.
multiplicity of forms of being, right? And the fact that he says nature for us from a Quilombo perspective
Mhm.
is not a resource, it's a source.
Mhm.
It's a source. So this is what, when we take nature as a source and all of nature as interlocutors, right? Then we're speaking from a cosmological perspective. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, the norms of the state are still speaking from a cosmophobic perspective. And here he, interestingly, he'll say, and he's not a reader of decolonial theory. He
Mhm.
develops his own, what he calls anti-colonial theory, right?
Mhm.
And he's basically a speaker. He's a person who has no academic background, but he's a thinker of his community. So, you know, he communicates his wisdom through orality a lot, and it's on internet, on YouTube especially, and in interviews rather than books. So he doesn't write. When he has written, it's someone else who has written with and for him. Now, what he says is that one of the things that our colonial epistemologies focus on is always confluence,
Mhm.
assimilation. So when they come across difference, they are looking for confluence. They're looking for a process of assimilation where the confluence assimilation always occur when there are two elements in connection, one more powerful to the other, and
Mhm.
where the power of the more powerful will create the conditions so that the more marginal element assimilates to the more powerful element.
Mhm. Mhm.
Confluence and assimilation, he said, yeah, this is in nature. We have our streams flow into ever bigger rivers, and our rivers flow into the sea. Right?
Mhm.
He says maybe this is where they meaning colonial, those who believe in colonial epistemology. Maybe this is where they get their thinking from. But we who live on the land, we are more connected to transfluence rather than confluence. And transfluence, I would interpret this as entanglement. So the difference between confluence or assimilation and transfluence is that he'll say, look, here we are the descendants of African slaves or enslaved Africans dislocated to a different continent in Brazil. We still maintain our links to our ancestrality. And how do we do that? We do that through a concept of transfluence, because if we did it through confluence, we would lose all our ancestrality and all our linguistic characteristics and phenomena, right? And our cultural beliefs. So transfluence is when we see the connection, the cosmological connection, not just between our rivers, our streams which flow into our rivers, which flow into the sea. The sea is not the end point. The sea is a meeting point, because it is the Atlantic in which the rivers that flow out of Africa also flow. Right? So the same clouds which bring the rain that wet our lands and flow into our rivers and then into the sea are also fed by the moisture that comes from Africa over the Atlantic Ocean. So we have these entanglements which go beyond bounded territories, right? which we are very conscious of in a cosmological view of the world, but not in a cosmophobic view of the world.
So in the cosmological view of the world, if you're going to talk about entanglement, so for you then, the appropriate way is to think of the global north and the global south, not so much like binary opposites, but as entangled within each other's, entangled, well, in a sense of entanglement, with a common shared future, but starting from diverse historical past. Is that the argument that you're making?
That's the argument I'm making, yes, because the other argument, which would be the cosmophobic argument, would emphasize separability, right? Unicity and separability. So I'm emphasizing interconnection. So yes, and I think this is what post-colonial and decolonial theories tend to do. They emphasize the fact that, yes, we've already been colonized for centuries, so we can't undo the clock and say, let's go back to before colonization. Now, what we can do, we don't necessarily have to continue colonization and become like our colonizers, but we can take into account the fact that, yes, we have been contaminated, polluted, all the negative terms that we could use by the colonizing intervention, but we can work from these because we can start from this entanglement. They are part of who we are, but it makes us, the fact that this is only a partial core. It is not totally who we are. That's what we have to deal with.
Okay. Now my next question then becomes, if I were to shift to your work, what do you think has been the impact of your work in Brazil on other scholars in the South and other scholars in the global North? If you were to reverse the whole thing, right? I know that it's not fair to think in those terms, but if what has been the overall impact when you sort of sit back quietly, what do you think has been the impact of your work on other areas across the globe?
You're asking me to abandon my modesty here.
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
I can tell you, I work from a prestige university, the University of São Paulo in Brazil, which is, I dare say, the main research university in the country. Other Brazilians here who are present, please correct me if I'm wrong, right? So it's a very elite university. And I've been here for 35 years, right? And to survive in this elite university, I've had to go the ground between the hegemony and the margins, right? And I do this, and one of the things that I've learned, as many of you who've been through experiences of being colonized and being victims of racism, what you know is over time you get to learn the laws. You get to learn what is possible and what is not possible, how you can use the same institution which is victimizing you in your favor, right? And so this is what I've done. My university is I'm in an English sector of the university, so it's English language and English literature. I'm in the English language, and so my university obliges me to only work with linguistics and not with literature. But in my experience, I've worked, before I began at this university, I spent a decade working with literature and language. Now, I'll show you one way of how I deal with this decolonially, where I work through the margins to within the language of the hegemony. So at the same time as the regulations of my university say it's a research university, and at the postgraduate level, we are, all of us professors of the university are obliged to dedicate 2/3 of our time to research and only 1/3 to teaching. And in our postgraduate work, we have the ethical obligation to bring our research back into the disciplines that we teach. We don't have set disciplines. We propose disciplines which are related to our research. And so I've given disciplines at the postgraduate level on post-colonial literature, where they can't tell me, oh no, but you're from linguistics, because you know, they could do this, but there's the higher law of the university which says, no, at postgraduate level, you have to bring your research into your postgraduate teaching. So I've been using the university as an elite space to deconstruct that elitism. Right? And I think over the years, I can say that I've done this a little bit in the area of language. All right, so we no longer, when I entered the university, our English language teaching disciplines were based on, guess what? The levels of socio, phonology, phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and very little semantics, no pragmatics. Right? Now we don't have anything of the sort. Right? Now we talk, our disciplines are based on language and culture, critical discourse. So just by looking at my little backyard,
yes,
I can tell you that I consider myself instrumental in the changes that have occurred.
Okay. Now let me ask you one last question, and then I will hand over to Edwin, because there are a number of questions in the chat box. From your vantage perspective, you've written quite a lot in Southern and decolonial scholarship, and you've written a lot of forewords to some of our work, for example, with Basi Antia and the other forthcoming. There's a conversation between you and me in the forthcoming book with Anna Demate. If you were to be precise, what do you think is the strength of the arguments we are trying to make in Southernizing sociolinguistics? Then don't be modest about it. What are the inherent philosophical weaknesses in that particular argument as well?
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I would say that one of the most basic arguments is start from the local. There is no global. The global is globalized local. Right?
Yeah, okay.
So perceive critically that even if you think you're not local, you are.
Yeah, okay.
So that's, I think, what I see that as common. It runs through my work. Now, what where the philosophical aspect, which is still weak, is where philosophy comes into contact with things like politics and ethics. Right? And so if we're not careful, we can be thrown into what looks like an anarchic politics. And here I refer to the work of Jacques Rancière, for example, and he says we should focus on the political and not politics, because the political is what precedes any kind of politics. And what is the political? The political is we are all different and we are all local. We are not different because we are individually different. We are different because we belong to different communities, which establish their own rules. And these different communities make their own conventions and associations and collaborations with other communities, but there's always that politics for Rancière is always something which he calls a distribution of the sensible, or the distribution of meaning. So politics is always one distribution of meaning imposed on the others. So when I critiqued monolingual linguistics, that would be the distribution of meaning that I see that as still predominating here in Brazil. Right? Now, what we have, how do you challenge politically? How do you challenge politically that distribution of the sensible? Right? That's the point. You can challenge it by pointing your finger and saying that this is authoritarian. It's not your only logic here is authoritarian. You don't have a logic which is better than my logic. And I'm not sure how that works out. So it points towards a politics of coalition, not to a politics of representation, right? Because a politics of representation distances itself from the community and the local progressively, right? Now, there is, in terms of that ethical, political, philosophical aspect, I'm also a reader of Foucault, and when the later Foucault talks about the fashioning of the self and the practices of the self as ethics, right? He begins to make distinctions in his work where he says politics is concerned, he makes a distinction between practices of freedom and practices of the self, where he understands, and here depending on how you read Foucault, is he a politician, is he a philosopher, what is he? So for Foucault, the politics of freedom presupposes that there is something called domination, right? Domination has to be resisted, opposed, right? Because domination oppresses. Now, domination is understood as a politics which is fixed, right? And this politics, which speaks of power as domination, is a politics which assumes that the subject is always abstract, homogeneous, right? It's an abstract, homogeneous subject which comes from liberal humanism, right? So all subjects are equal, and all subjects are equally dominated. So a practice, Foucault begins to feel frustrated with practices of freedom, because they can't effectively enough challenge the domination. And then he thinks his concept of power not as domination, but as power relations. Now, when you speak of power relations, you're talking about a system which is more dynamic, meaning there are spaces for intervention, right? And then when he speaks of power relations, he speaks of no longer practices of freedom, but practices of the self, which he says is the ethical dimension, because it refers to practices, right? And for him, the ethics has got nothing to do with the liberal concept of ethics presupposing morality. Here, the ethics is the fashioning of the self. So for Foucault, assuming not a model of power.
Edwin, can I hand over to you?
Sorry? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Prof, you can continue.
Okay. So when Foucault changes from power as domination to power as relations, he says that he focuses on the concept of a subject that is heterogeneous, because subjects are constituted by discourses. And here he introduces his notion of criticality. So this subject that is constituted by discourses can problematize or reflect on the discourses that constitute him or her, and then accordingly act by either using these discourses and emulating these discourses or transforming these discourses. And this is the ethical dimension of the practices of the self. And the objective of the practices of the self is to influence, and here he goes back to Greek society. The objective of the practice of the self is to influence the others around you. So there is no self without others. So what motivates the practices of the self for self-fashioning in a either transformative manner or reproductive manner is the need to affect those around you. And when you are recognized as being someone who should be emulated, respected, you get the respect of your communities because you have succeeded. So this kind of politics apparently, it appears to be very individual, right? But it's not individual in the liberal humanist sense, because it assumes that the subject is constituted by discourses which are socio-historic. But there is that possibility for the subject to act on the discourses that constitute him or her. Now, my political, philosophical, ethical dilemma is, how do these work through? Where do they lead us to?
Let me hand over, thanks a lot. Let me hand over to Edwin, because there are a lot of questions in the chat, and then there are a number of other people who may want to raise their comments and suggestions, and the conversation continues. Edwin, right.
Thanks a lot. So the forum has been opened for everyone to ask questions. So if you'd like to ask questions, a question or something along those lines, or comment on something, you can raise your hands and I'll call on you. So before I call on those who have raised their hands, I'd like to ask a few questions that have been put in the chat box. And so Clarissa has a question, but she begins by thanking you. And she says, my question is, when we talk about multilingualism, how does this have implications to our teaching of English in Brazil? For example, would you consider would you consider as multilingual as students who speak only one named language? In other words, is there multilingualism within one named language?
Yes, thank you for that question, Clarissa. Definitely, because that's what, when I refer to Kumchandani, obviously I'm reading Kumchandani critically as well. So when Kumchandani makes his rather facile distinction between monolingualism or north-centric monolingualism and south-centric, let's say, multilingualism, there is no homogenic monolingualism ever, right? So the work that I've been doing in Brazil, which falls under, within applied linguistics, falls under what we have come to call educational linguistics, or educação linguística, calls attention to this. So our focus, and here, with my colleague Valkyria Montemor, we were invited to write the national curriculum for the teaching of English at high school, about 15 years ago. And what we did was we said, this space for teaching English in our school curriculum, and which is supposedly the space for teaching a foreign language, but it ends up being the space for teaching English. This is a space in which we, as critical educators, we have to use this to question certain things, right? So first, why is it English within the space of a foreign language and not other foreign languages, right? French very marginally existed at the time in our curricula, or school curricula. Spanish came in and out and is maybe coming back in again, but it's very, very predominantly English. So the way that we suggest this is to create what we called, within educational linguistics, a multilingual or multicultural awareness. So here we're thinking about our Brazilian students, not in private schools, but in the schools in our agricultural interior, the schools in our urban peripheries, where all of these students speak different varieties of Portuguese, which when they get to the school, very often they don't even know that the language they speak is called Portuguese until they get into school. Most of them call it Brazilian. When they get into school, they hear their teachers telling them, speak Portuguese properly, right? Or stop speaking like that. That's not even Portuguese. And they are given they have to undergo this psychological shock that they're bringing language behavior which is not even recognized as language. So this is the multilingual awareness that we have to bring to even not just our foreign language teachers, our national language teachers as well, right? That there is variation in Portuguese. The variation is not just geographic, it's social, right? It is variation of gender, all the typical sociolinguistic complexity we have in any language. We have this in Portuguese. And on top of this, as Gabriel, who's present here, will say, we also have this racist element in our linguistic perspective of Brazilian Portuguese, which likes to promote the fact that our Portuguese comes from Portugal, right? And ignores the fact that for 200 years, when slavery was the official model, economic model during colonial Brazil, 2/3 of the population of the country were of African origin. Now, there was no official teaching of Portuguese at the time. These enslaved Africans had to learn forcibly and haphazardly learn Portuguese. And obviously, for 200 years, they had an effect on Brazilian Portuguese, right? If not on our written Portuguese, which is still very much literary and emulates the models of Iberia, in our spoken Portuguese, which has all of these characteristics, which could be African, could be European, but that discussion is not even brought forward, right? It is assumed by our elite linguists that no, there is no African influence in our Brazilian spoken Portuguese. So besides multilingualism, we have this, in Brazil, we have this strong attitude against even seeing the multi in our own language. So, how can we see the multi in English, for example? But the good work being done recently, by Clarissa Jordan, my colleague here at my university, Ana Paula Duboc, etc., and many other important people, where they focus on English as a lingua franca, no longer English as a monolithic, monolingual language. Right? So what has happened in English as a lingua franca for many of us in Brazil is we have moved from the focus on the code to the focus on the user.
Okay. Anna also has a question. And Anna says, can you say a bit more about how you are defining local? Does local mean a nation state, a town, a community, a person? I ask you to beautifully mention that everything comes down to local. But how does the local get defined in your understandings of theory and thought related to your work?
Okay, thank you. An important question. Yeah, the local it's not state, it's not nation. It is and it isn't community. Right? And here I'd like to refer to the work done by the Indian post-colonial scholars Partha Chatterjee and Gyan Prakash, when they look at the importance of community and how community worked in India, and communities, how community worked in contact with the imposition of colonial epistemologies. So basically, what they're saying is we can't speak of community as being pure, community as being the tradition as opposed to modernity. Right? We can speak of community, and here I'll make the bridge with Antonio Bispos, the Quilombo thinker, his thinking. So we can talk about community as transfluence, entanglement, interconnected. So these Indian philosophers will refer to community in India now as a belated modernity, because though community during colonial times was portrayed as the other to modernity, community was generalized and homogenized. Right? And then after, during the anti-colonial movement in India, community was taken on board to oppose the modernity of the European colonial project. Right? But it was not the same community. It was now a community subjected to the influences of modernity. right? Like the concept of oneness, of singularity, the concept of modeling, right? The concept of the norm above everything else. These were the concept of science. So the community became, we're speaking about a belated modernity in a concept when we think of community. So here in Brazil, what I mean by, I say by local, yes, community, but don't think of your community as being divorced from other communities or from what we call the state or the nation. We have to look at community as being constantly interconnected. We have to look for the contradictions that we have in our community, not to eliminate them, because it's our contradictions which are spaces for change. They are pedagogic. Now, we should avoid falling into these dichotomies, and we talk about the local and the community. Homi Bhabha, in his work in the 90s, made a distinction also between what he called the pedagogic and the performative. The pedagogic were the colonial discourses, prescriptive colonial discourses of the nation. And the performative were the everyday discourses, cultures of the local that were going on, independent of the prescriptions of the nation, of the pedagogies of the nation. So we have this, he says we're informed by this dynamic between the pedagogic and the performative. I would say that we have to be careful when we focus on entanglement and interaction and the local, we also have to be aware that there is an element of modernity, of the pedagogic, of the prescriptiveness at work. One example is that, okay, so what are we doing in terms of language at our local level? Are we saying that we are doing away with norms because the norm is oppressive, it's homogenizing us, it's reducing our heterogeneity, right? Or are we substituting one norm for another? And my suspicion is that very often at a local level, we tend to substitute one norm which we see as oppressive for another norm just because we see it as local, but it ends up being as oppressive. Now, within Hansier's theory of the distribution of the sensible, each norm is a particular distribution of meaning. But a norm has always its historicity. A norm will always need to be challenged and transformed and undergo pressure. Right? So norms are not here, okay, I'm talking about linguistic cultural norms. Norms are not something to be done away with because we need them in language, right? Norms are something we have to be conscious of, aware of what are their, what do they allow us to do? What are their allowances and what are their limits? So I think we have to be critically aware of our need for norms and at the same time our capacity to transform them. This is always at the local level.
Can I ask a quick follow-up about my question, which is, I think I really appreciate, the idea of entanglements. I think it's really, just really important for numerous reasons. But what was interesting to me is that I think Makoni had asked you about, some of the steps that some of the theories need to take to further develop. And your point, one of your key points was that there needs to be more of a focus on the local because really everything is local. However, if there is an entanglement between local and global, and really, a lot of what you're saying is that the local is global and the global is local, then how do you see that entanglement working with the current definitions of local? And how are those actually two separate things if really kind of what I'm hearing is that they are ultimately entangled?
Yes, thank you for that question, Anna. Perhaps I didn't make this clear. It's a very entangled business to make clear. Now, firstly, entanglement doesn't exist at a horizontal levels. It's not everything goes, and it's not all permissible. Right? We have to remember that we are speaking from a location traversed by power relations. Right? So yes, so the first thing I said is we have to identify, interrogate, and interrupt anything that proposes itself as the global, or anything that proposes itself as a norm, let's say, even at a local level, right? We'll have the global at the local level, which is what the local norm, for example, is the global at the local level. Right? Now, what I'm saying is that the first thing we have to do is point our finger at what calls itself the norm and the global, and say, rethink yourself, you are also equally local. The difference is that you have more power than we do, right? So let's negotiate. We demand negotiation, right? What in a political, bring this into a political dimension here, the work of the Belgian philosopher of science, Isabelle Stengert, is interesting. She works on what she calls cosmopolitics. Right? So where cosmopolitics, cosmos is not a space, right? It refers to, maybe it's useful here also to bring in the distinction between space and place. And on here, I think the Chinese thinker Yifu Tuan made an interesting distinction between place and space, where he says that where space is, let's say, geographical, place is space can be counted and it's geographical. Place is that ambience of lived experience, right? So it's not measurable, it's not countable. Right? Now, what the politics that Stengert proposes, and which I find interesting, what she calls cosmopolitics, is she says, speaking of the different epistemologies and ontologies existent in the world, we meet in a cosmos, and the cosmos is not a space, it's a place, meaning it's a place where lived experiences come into contact with each other, whatever they are. So it's not a space which is geographically named or geographically localizable, right? It's a place of interconnection, confrontation of different lived experiences. Now, what kind of politics appears here? If we're not careful, it's a politics of confrontation. And she warns us against a politics of the problems of a politics of confrontation. And she warns us against possible attempts at abandoning a politics of confrontation, such as an ethical stance of tolerance. She says tolerance is a curse. It's not an ethic, it's a curse, because tolerance says, okay, I have my lived experience, I have my values, my norms, and I understand that you have yours, but let's agree to disagree, right? That's not possible in a cosmopolitics. We can't agree to disagree because we have inequalities of power, right? So when you say let's agree to disagree, you may be silencing me, right? In effect. So she rejects the possibility of tolerance in this kind of politics, and she points to the possibility of the political action of abandoning certainty. She says the most difficult process of this politics is to abandon certainty. Now, this is taken up, this abandoning of certainty is taken up in a different context, not related to Stengert, also by the Portuguese thinker Boaventura Souza Santos. And he says in intercultural contact, we also have to abandon our certainties and our truths as being truths. we have to understand that our truths only have the valency as truth for us, not for others. So we have to be open to the possibility of truth of the others. This is the serendipity notion that I mentioned that Kupchandani promotes. Right? We have to be open to the other possibilities. This is also the notion that I mentioned previously of connected to what Gayatri Spivak proposed way back as abandoning one's privilege or questioning one's privilege. So our politics, Chris Stroud of Cape Town talks about this as accepting vulnerability. We have to accept our vulnerability, whether we think of ourselves as dominant or not dominant, in order for a politics of dialogue to occur. So when we are all equally vulnerable, we're all equally local. Okay, and that's where now, what's the next step politically? Apart from avoiding killing ourselves, right? That's where we are at, I think, in terms of environmental politics at the moment. We all understand the importance of the planet for all of us equally, but we find it very difficult to abandon our privileges.
Yeah.
Edwin, I have a comment higher up in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm about to read that. So we have to be careful. Arthur is saying we have to be careful not to reduce US or European linguistics to caricatures and stereotypes. For example, US linguistics has always been concerned with the individual speaker, discourse, embodied language or speak, decolonization, multilingualism, etc. The stereotypes of Western linguistics re-marginalize sectors of Western, and more specifically, US linguistics. And we have to be more careful to learn from the buried and ignored work in these Western colonial traditions, rather than ignoring their existence. Just think of the work of Himes, Gampers, Swadesh, Sapir, all US scholars. Arthur, would you like to add more to?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, thank you for that. No, I'm not abandoning.
Yeah, and it's important. I
okay.
added a thank you for your presentation right below. I should have begun my comments by thanking you for your presentation, and your emphases should all be major guideposts in our scholarship. So I just wanted to make that appreciation clear.
Okay, Arthur, yes, because you can see that my work comes from a reading of Himes. When I talk about space and the local, I'm talking about the ethnographic, right? And obviously, it's rhetorically, when you talk about stereotypes, unfortunately, we end up sounding like we are speaking in terms of stereotypes, right? So when I talk about North-centric linguistics, I'm not talking about European linguistics specifically or US linguistics specifically, but I'm also saying while there are a lot of people who do take into account individual speakers, transactional practices, what's happening from an ethnographic perspective on the ground, you also have the colonial linguists working and coexisting with these people. I can tell you that because I graduated from the linguistics department of the University of Reading, and I have had firsthand experience with colonial linguistics. But I've also, with these same people, and one of my professors was Peter Trudgill. In the same department, there were also people who showed me the way to Himes, etc. So yes, I'm not, if I'm criticizing monolithics, I accept that criticism. I hope I'm not sounding as, and I'm criticizing dichotomies, I'm talking about entanglement. So even when we're talking about two opposing camps, we have to understand there is entanglement also within each camp. Okay. So yes, it's complexity on complexity on complexity.
Okay. Arthur, you are muted. You are muted.
Okay, one thing that I like to emphasize is the burying and ignoring of these traditions within, quote, colonial spaces, unquote. Basically the North, as we talk about in decolonial studies. There is so much important information, and I think the term buried is appropriate because it relates directly to what we're talking about. For example, in US linguistics, the history of it, much of the work was focused on Native American languages and communities. And just to understand the grammar of those languages, many of them, you were forced to deal with discourse, the individual versus the society that they were a part of, and all of those things that you really highlighted in your presentation. Often and this is my last comment, often I have thought that there has to be some way to acquaint current students with all of these research traditions that are now basically buried and ignored because they relate directly to what we often consider the avant-garde, the cutting edge, and so on and so forth. But it's a very dull edge because it's been dealt with for over 100 years.
Yeah, thank you. It's important to remember that. And maybe going back to the initial, what we began with initially when I said we have a recognition of multilingualism in our constitution, but not in practice, right? I think amongst our students, they read sociolinguistics, they'll read Hymes, but when it comes down to them analyzing this in practice, something very different may occur. Let me give you an example. This is, do we have time for this, Edwin?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, okay. An example when I was working about 20 years ago with indigenous communities in the Amazon here in Brazil. This was shortly after 1988 when our constitution came out and it recognized Brazil as a multilingual nation, specifying the indigenous multilingualism. What happened was that, again, as a result of the same constitution which said that all citizens have a right to state education, what happened immediately in the years after 88 was that suddenly the state had to face its obligation of providing indigenous schools on indigenous territory, right? And the first several things happened here. The first thing is that they contracted loads of Brazilian sociolinguists and linguists to go to indigenous communities, because before they could have an indigenous school, these languages were basically oral. They had to reduce these languages into written form, right? To produce textbooks and then provide these schools with textbooks. There was a whole kind of problematic of implementing an indigenous school. Now, when it went through these different steps, systematizing the oral language, reducing it to writing, right? Producing textbooks. Here, even though this was being done by the interlocutors with these indigenous communities were linguists and sociolinguists. It's amazing. I was witness to this. It's amazing how that learning disappeared. So what happens when you are out in doing field work, ethnographic field work, distant from your academy? I'll just give you one or two examples. Firstly, I was working in a region in the Western Amazon near the Peruvian border, where these communities are exogamic, meaning they marry outside. They don't marry inside their communities. They marry with the neighboring community. Now, why are they exogamic? Because all of these cultures in the Amazon in general, they're cultures of alterity and otherness. For them, the concept of language as a single code or monolingualism makes no sense. These are languages of evidentials, where whatever they say is marked by who said it. Is it said by a self or by another? Now, when these linguists came down in the community that I happened to be at, to convince that community that they had to put their language into writing, and to make it more economic, this was the instruction of our Ministry of Education, to make it more economic, these linguists had to convince this community that they spoke the same language as the community downriver, right? Because when we speak of indigenous communities in Brazil, generally we're speaking of communities of maximum 200, 250 people. Now, the expense of producing, transforming into a writing form each linguistic phenomenon of each community of 250 people, and then producing textbooks for these, drove our Ministry of Education berserk. So these people were, and this is how their capitalism interferes or gets entangled with community. So these linguists had to convince these communities that they spoke the same language. Now, if they spoke the same language, these people, resisted terribly, said, no, we don't speak the language. And the linguists would say, oh, no, they're just little phonetic differences of pronunciation, but actually it's the same word. You could write it in the same way and pronounce it differently. That doesn't matter, you can pronounce it differently. But the members of the community would say, no, we don't speak the same language. We can't write in the same way. Because if they spoke the same language, they would not be able to marry with each other, because they would be the same, it would be incest, right? So here, I mean, there was a gap in our sociolinguistic ethnographic education, which said, do more anthropology, right? Study it's not just focus on the local. It's not just getting the native point of view. It's trying to abandon the certainty of your point of view, the truthfulness of your point of view, and opening yourself through serendipity to this newness of a different point of view.
Great example.
Yeah. Prof. Souza, I would like to ask the next couple of questions in pairs, if you don't mind, so that we could move a little bit faster. So Marie is asking, can you elaborate on time, space, entanglement? Can you elaborate more on that? And yeah, and then
okay.
Okay.
Sorry, you want to put two questions? I may forget the second one.
Or would it be okay, or I should?
Go on.
Okay. And this one is also asking, for any scholar who commits to decolonial scholarship and enacting change in educational practices that continue to be colonial, what might be some important questions to study or areas to engage in action at the local level? He's asking this because he's thinking of thousands of small African towns that are wrestling with the colonial while working to become developed through education. So those are the two questions.
Interesting. I see connections, I guess. The time and space, because time is what brings us the notion of development, right? So development means abandoning something primitive and going to something recent, modern, right? When, and here I go back to Kupchandani, where he says that there's been a European obsession with time. There is this obsession with time, I would respond to Kupchandani in India as well, when people speak of the ancient and ancient traditions and texts itself. So I can't see anyone being not guilty of succumbing to the pressure of time. But we can focus only on time which would bring us to our conception of development, of modernity, which is purely time-based and which looks at time as being linear, right? It doesn't accept time, for example, and here where the time-space connection would be important and make a difference to how we see time. So it's not a simple dichotomy, time as opposed to space. If we see the entanglement of time and space, then we can look at time from a particular space, and it looks different. So if we look at time from, let's say, the spaces that I have worked with in indigenous communities in Brazil, time is not, the past is not a different country. The past is not something that you cannot return to. For them, the past runs parallel to the present. And I'm sure in Africa, you must have similarities with this. The past is accessible. It runs parallel to the present. So you can change the past through the present. The past is not something that is gone. And the basis of shamanic medicine in the Amazon is this. So you identify in shamanic medicine, you identify an ailment and a sickness as being symptoms of causes from the past, right? And what does the shamanic healer do? He has to voyage to the past to identify these symptoms and correct them so you can get better. So the past is perfectly accessible, and the past from this perspective is something that can be transformed. Right? And when they speak of their histories, what bothers certain anthropologists who try to draw up histories of these communities, of oral traditions. Again, I'm sure this happens in Africa and Asia, where the oral tradition predominates. The concept of history is not as fixed as in written traditions, where we accumulate texts. History is countable by the number of texts we can accumulate. The concept of history in these oral traditions that I've worked with, the history is reformulated all the time. And I've used a metaphor of the ball and the chain, where the medieval punishment of the ball and the chain. Now the chain is always the same length, and the ball, the iron ball attached to the iron chain, which is then attached to the wrongdoer's leg. Right? Now that metaphor says that when that person walks, that ball is always at the same distance from the leg of that person, right? But that ball is always moving. Now that is the concept that I found in the community, the concept of time that I found in the communities that I dealt with. They do have a past, yes, but that past, like that ball on the chain, is constantly changing, it's moving, it's not static. So when I say time and space, I'm saying, no, we don't look at space divorced from time divorced from space, but we look at time beginning from the particular spatial context.
Yeah, and so with Desmond's question, he also wanted to know some areas that they can be, these communities can begin to engage in. So,
Edwin, do you mind that I just chime in here to clarify the question I was trying to ask?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Please do.
Yes, Lynn, again, thank you again for what I think is unsurprisingly brilliant and insightful remarks this morning. It's good to see you again. I think, it's fairly clear that anyone who's been looking at the development in linguistics scholarship has noticed a shift in thinking that, like you noted, doesn't really reflect what's happening in practice. It seems like people outside of the academia are in many ways completely oblivious for various reasons, some perhaps good reasons, of those shifts that are happening in the academia. So for anyone who is interested in scholarship, but not just scholarship in the way it's been done, but scholarship that's understood as an engagement with the community, that is action-oriented, wanting to contribute to those conversations in various levels. what might be some of the areas to begin to do that, both for scholarship and for action, especially recognizing that in many communities, especially the ones I mentioned I was thinking about, there's so many who continue to engage with this thing called development. People are trying to become developed. They're thinking of a monolingual education. How do you get all children to school? How do you get more textbooks? I mean, it's all enveloping in the ways that people are processing, not just the linguistic aspect, but every other part of the social and cultural that have now been sucked into this colonial vortex. What can one be doing without sort of swooping in to say, hey, we need a new thinking here. I think I have the right way to think about this. So I'm just wondering how one can engage in scholarship and action-oriented engagement with the community in these times.
Yeah. Yes, Desmond, I think that's important. I think if we say, I'm speaking not just as a linguist, I'm speaking as an applied linguist, and I think I consider it a privilege to work as an applied linguist with teachers, right? But I think, yes, we have the activist dimension is extremely important if we are not going to continue writing to ourselves, right? So, or just, dear author, I'm writing to myself, right? And this is my thinking to myself. The activism comes and we get out, it involves outreach, it involves getting out of our academies. We have this possibility in Brazil where we can work with teachers and in education. And so I'll give you an example of how I have done it. And obviously, this is not, it had its problems, but in this national curriculum that I helped to write 15 years ago, previously the national curriculum was based on the southeast of Brazil, which is the industrialized, urbanized, wealthy, and I would say white southeast of Brazil, right? And so all models of knowledge, models of learning, all our exam systems came out of here to the rest of this almost continental-sized country, right? So we had people, teachers, let's say 4,000 kilometers away from São Paulo, right? In rural communities, being forced to implement a national curriculum based on urban, middle-class, white, rich, industrialized São Paulo. It made no sense to them. The teaching of English as a foreign language, which is where I contributed specifically, to someone 4,000 kilometers away from the nearest foreigner, was something totally unreal, right? So, but this was also the possibility of saying, no, because you are so distant and you're so isolated, you don't need a foreign language. Let's remove the foreign language. That was also not an acceptable possibility, departing from the presupposition that we learn through alterity. Alterity helps us develop our sense of critique. So learning a foreign language and learning about a foreign culture is very important. So the first questions, we didn't produce a content for this. National syllabus assumes a content. We only furnished questions. The questions were, how much, and these were aimed at teachers. It was not to be used in the classroom, aimed at teachers. How much do you know, or what is your experience, and how much do you know of the foreign language, in that case, English, right? What resources do you have available to you? 80% didn't have textbooks available, right? Many didn't even have electricity at the time, right? They didn't have internet. Right? All of these things which were taken for granted in the urban centers. Right? Now, you may find this strange. Many of them didn't even speak English, right? Now, what happens? How do they get to be English teachers? Because we have this cultural mechanism in Brazil where we say we learn, we have this leeway to deal with our problems. So if there is no teacher in a particular area, you take the teacher who knows most about that particular subject, and you can imagine what it means, how variable it can mean to be who knows more about English that was the teacher, right? So we had to depart from that. These were our resources, right? So then we made suggestions like, what can you teach? We abandoned that standard publisher, textbook-oriented, North-centric oriented form of teaching English. The 4 skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening. That doesn't work. No grammatical orientation, that doesn't work. So questions what questions can you use? What does a foreign language help you to do? How can it contribute to the education of a citizen? Right? By identifying and respecting difference. So don't teach English grammar, but when you focus on verb tenses, what is the objective of a verb tense or the function of a verb tense? The construction of time. Right? So reflect with your students on how time is constructed in their own languages. And then show them how time is constructed in other languages. Family relationships, how are these constructed? Terms of address, how do these appear? So it wasn't teaching a language, it was teaching linguistic sensitivity, awareness, right? And by doing this, these people could feel competent as teachers, right? They were contributing to the education in the full sense of the word of these students, right? So it wasn't only our local teachers in Sao Paulo could make their students fluent. Very few of them could, but they could make their students fluent in English. These teachers at a distance could also feel that pedagogically they have accomplished something. So I think it's this is what I mean by sensitivity to context and to localness. Right? So, and this is the activist aspect of the work. Right? Contributing to education as reflection, as critique.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Ben Rampton also has a question. He prefaces by saying, thanks for a really interesting talk. You mentioned social linguistic analysis of data being monolingual in orientation. And he wonders, what would non-monolingual analysis of, example, a lesson or a committee meeting look like?
Right. So when I say a non-multilingual, let me give you examples of what, having grown up having been born I was born in the Yemen, which at the time was a British colony. I was then educated in an English boarding school. Now, one of my first experiences in the English boarding school was, what language do you speak? My multilingual experience was that I don't know what languages I spoke, because the languages I spoke were never named. Languages changed according to where you used them, if it was in the street, at the home, or even it was to a father as opposed to your mother, right? So I had no idea that I spoke different languages, right? So in one of the first, let's say, problematic engagements that I was thrown into at my boarding school was speak your language. Right? Now, the presupposition there was that you have a language, you have only one, right? And you have something called a mother tongue. None of those presuppositions existed for me. I didn't know I had a language. I thought I spoke English. So I thought, what the hell? What do they mean, speak your language? I'm speaking English. It's my language. Right? So what I understood from there was that they were asking me to mark my difference. Right? So there was that the racialization going on there, but they couldn't see that. Right? They were apparently just saying, speak your language. Don't you understand what speaking your language is? As if, it's the meaning is in the words. Right? Other things like one of my citizenship is British, right? One of them. And I had, in British racism, I had this sentence thrown back to me all the time. go back to where you come from. You don't belong here. And hearing these words, when I heard these words, I thought, I'm a British citizen. I do belong here. What do you mean, go back to where I come from? So these are the things. Apparently, there's no multilingualism no multiculturalism taking place. They may seem like imperatives, just simple phrases as imperatives. For me, they were very complex transactions. And let's say the force of these expressions were always discriminatory rejections, right? They were pushing me away in a corner. But if I tried to discuss these with my interlocutors, they would deny all of this. They couldn't possibly see. So an example of a multilingual transaction may not even have to be multilingual. Now, another thing that another example I could give is Judith Butler, when she's in one of her books, I think it's called Narrating the Subject. I'm not sure, giving an account of oneself. She speaks of people from marginal cultures, marginal communities, trying to give an account of themselves, narrating themselves with the I, assuming the I to narrate themselves. And she points to the contradiction and the possible problems in terms of power relations of these narrations of the self. And she says, these people are narrating themselves, even though they are by narrating themselves, they are trying to fully affirm their existence. They are narrating themselves in a discourse which preceded them, in a discourse whose norms were constructed by the dominant community that excluded them. So even though these people who are marginalized start with a self-narration with an I, the power of that self-narration of the I has already been interrupted by the fact that the language they speak in, the discourse they are using, is not theirs. It preceded them. It belongs to the dominant group. Right? Okay, now I would respond to Judith Butler by saying, what happens if in that kind of context, I narrate myself using my multilingual repertoire, using my multilingual, moving from one language to another. So I can narrate myself apparently to my interlocutor, who is the monolingual speaker and who sees himself or herself as the owner of the discourse that I'm using. And what if I narrate myself using my language, using the multiple resources that I have of multiple languages? Then my listener, who also sees him or herself as the owner of my discourse, is thrown into a state of uncomprehension. And there, I am interrupting the discourse, the dominant discourse that thinks it constitutes me. So these are, I think, to understand how these multilingual discourses work, maybe we have to adopt a multilingual perspective and not a monolingual perspective. If we adopt a monolingual perspective, we are looking for separability, right? We are looking for one language as opposed to another. We are looking for ownership. We're looking for even mother tongue, right? And one of the things that in my experience I see, and here referring to my Indian ancestry, we have the concept of a mother tongue that we may not even speak, but we hold on to dearly because it's extremely important to our identity. So yes, I have a mother tongue that I don't even speak. It's called Konkani, right? But it's the mother tongue that I have in common with my other relatives spread over the world who equally don't speak it, but they all equally recognize it as their mother tongue. So who says the mother tongue has got to be your first dominant language? that's to give an example of the otherness of from which multilingualism can also be seen. Ben, I hope you, that made sense.
Well, just to say that, you know, it makes great deal of sense, but also is enriched by your, for me anyway, enriched by what you said to Arthur. You know, embedded in that kind of empirical perspective. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So we'll take the last round of questions and then we'll end the recorded session. Scott is asking, he starts by thanking you. And he says, you mentioned Laxman Kapshandani. I don't know if I mentioned the name right. Could you kindly cite a good beginning text for introducing oneself to Laxman's thinking? Many thanks.
Yes. Let me see. Can you see this? It's called Revisualizing Boundaries, a Plurilingual Ethos. Right. The problem with Lakshman Kapshandani, who is unfortunately no longer alive, is he was writing within the his context of Indian sociolinguists from the 70s to the 90s, where Eurocentric linguistics and sociolinguistics was very predominant in India. So as he was questioning Eurocentric linguistics and sociolinguistics in India, he was very much marginalized by the Indian Academy. Right? So unfortunately, his books are not readily available, but they're still accessible. One or two things you can find online. Photocopies of chapters of his books are available online. A chapter called The Plurilingual Ethos is a photocopy of a chapter from one of his books called Plurilingual Ethos. Have a look at it on the internet. It's available online. That would be a good starting point.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And then Ashraf has a question. He's asking, how do you reflect on the notion of democracy from this Western perspective, which divorces space from time?
Asking me in Brazil at the present moment how I reflect on democracy, that's a good one, yeah. Democracy, again, our Eurocentric notions of democracy are basically representative democracy, right? Which, when representative democracy, meaning voting for a representative and selecting a representative, right, as members of parliament for a legislative assembly, right, which apparently appears to guarantee the plurality of communities and beliefs and values that we have accessible in our community. That at the moment is the model of democracy we have in Brazil, right? But it's still not effective because not necessarily, it's not ineffective necessarily because of democracy may not be effective. It's not effective because it comes into contact again with our local histories. And when we see we live in a country which is still very much culturally under the model of our feudal, we still have a feudal form of thinking, right? Where we have our oligarchies are still very important in Brazil. I'm not going to generalize with Latin America, but say there are similarities with Latin America, right? So electing a representative to be in parliament is not necessarily electing someone who's going to represent your shortcomings and your needs and necessities. This may simply be someone who you consider to be capable of representing you, because that person may belong to a feudal family and a family that has authority, a landowning family who you see as having voice in the parliament in our capital. Right? So you end up in many cases electing as your representative someone so distant from you, right? Someone who's not going to represent you at all. So it's not exactly and someone who's going to be corrupt, I mean, needless to say. So it's not a question of the model of democracy being wrong. It's our model of democracy has got to be rethought within our cultural context. Right? So we're still looking for new forms of democracy. Obviously, we have some communities who do consciously and critically elect their representatives, but the great majority, unfortunately, don't. And let me say here, fortunately, long gone last president was an example of this. Good riddance to our last president.
Yeah. Okay. So we'd like to end here. I would hand over to Prof. Makoni for the closing remarks.
Lynn Mario, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It provided us, I think, with an interesting view about some of the evolving notions that are coming up in decolonial and Southern scholarship. What was interesting to me was how you were trying to do two things more or less simultaneously. Contextualize your arguments within Brazil, but at the same time, link up some of these concepts to broader debates elsewhere. That I thought was a very interesting way to think about this, that we have to think both locally and globally simultaneously, because in as much as we are locally grounded, we have an international audience that we are constantly engaged with. And the question that I will go through trying to see how I can answer it, or when I'm teaching my students how to address it, is your response to Ben Rampton's question about, okay, how do you then teach students, for example, how to carry out a multilingual analysis? What I found this interesting is I serve as an associate editor for the Journal Applied Linguistics, and we get a lot of submissions on translanguaging, et cetera, et cetera. But once the data analysis, once the people have submitted the articles, get into the data analysis, they seem to revert to some other ontological views of language that seem to have preceded any translanguaging. It's as if the translanguaging as a framework is difficult to subject to a translanguaging analysis. That I thought was quite interesting. What would be interesting as we move now into the after party is to see what the connections are between what you have been arguing and some of the work that Ben has been doing on language crossing, etc. Well, that would be an interesting conversation about entanglement. But before we get there, Vishna Okim will announce who is our next speaker.